Good morning, Bob Armstrong in Vancouver.
Bob Ages.
Bob Ages in Vancouver, and Jane Armstrong in Toronto, and I'm Doug Miller here in Montreal, representing the Southern Africa Activist Anti-Apartheid Activist History Project, and working with SAC2 Solidarity Committee to interview union militants that had been involved in the struggle in the 1970s and 80s and 90s. And today with Bob Ages in Vancouver. Again, good morning and welcome. And I just wanted to make sure that you'd had a chance to go through the consent form and you understand that this is for public dissemination, that it'll be archived and accessible to researchers and students and educationalists. Do you agree to be interviewed under those terms?
Yes, I've seen it and have no problem with things being public.
Perfect. Listen, Bob, I usually ask a very general question. It's really interesting to know something of your background. I'm totally, I admit it, Central Canadian. I don't know the West past Toronto much. And so please, could you just introduce yourself, where you're from, a bit about your background, how you actually ran into SAC2 eventually and anti-apartheid as part of your agenda?
Oh, God. I was actually born in Ottawa, and my first involvement, it was very minor, actually. I think I was a high school student. I was very involved in radical politics, high school politics, Vietnam War. And the South African ambassador was speaking, I think it was at Carleton University, though it might have been Ottawa U. I'm pretty sure it was Carleton. Would have been around 1970. So a number of us decided to go and picket the place. And I mean, the change, from later on where people like Maloney and Harper tried to take credit for being anti-racist and anti-apartheid was, I mean, it was typical that we were considered crazy radicals for opposing South African apartheid, and we got the cops called on us. That was just one of many things issues I was involved in. Just a particular incident we thought couldn't go unopposed. My real involvement came later. I moved out to the prairies in 1974 for work. I didn't want to be a civil servant, so I got involved driving truck and then wound up in Winnipeg in 1976 or 7, got a job at the railway. And so got involved with of course, it was a unionized workplace. So I got involved in the union movement there. Was a shop steward, local executive member. I was elected to the Executive Labour Council. I got involved with the MFL Human Rights Committee. So it was really in connection with all that this was obviously an issue that was quite prominent, and you couldn't really be involved in that stuff, especially human rights stuff, without saying, hey, we got to support the movement against apartheid in South Africa. So that would have been the mid 80s. Now, I was involved a lot more with Latin American solidarity. Obviously, we'd had the situation working with Chilean refugees who'd come, there are a lot in Canada, and then, of course, supporting Nicaragua and the FMLN in El Salvador. But obviously, South Africa was another issue. International imperialism gives you lots of opportunities to support different movements. So I want to be clear. I mean, the work against apartheid wasn't the only or even the most central to the activity I was doing, and I wasn't particularly central to the committee, but it was, as I said, everything was sort of interlocked. The key thing that kind of happened, I believe it was 1985. I actually did a little Googling to refresh my memory on dates. It's so long ago. The NDP government, which had been elected several years before, had committed to ending the import of South African wines, which was good. I believe Ontario did it slightly after. But they were in a situation where they had South African wine in inventory, which you didn't want to just dump. And as a wine lover, I kind of actually sympathize with that. So what they decided the appropriate thing to do was to donate the proceeds. I'm not sure if it was the gross sales or just the profit of Manitoba Liquor, or whatever it was called, to the anti-apartheid movement in Winnipeg. So for the first time, rather than just being a handful of volunteers, they actually had money to rent a little office, get a Xerox machine. I think we even had a staff or part-time staff for a little while the money lasted. So we were able to actually, do a little more and continue the public education work. And so basically, I just helped out with some of the events, got to know, I believe it was Dr. Ahmed Randri was the ANC rep, and Srini Reddy, he was the head of Frontier College, which did educational outreach. So he had but he helped the work, was a close partner with Dr. Randri in kind of heading up. And then there were young people and students and, union supporters like me who, helped with some events and stuff like that. I helped set up the office, some practical stuff. And, those were kind of the, sort of the framework. Then there were kind of a couple of fun incidents we got involved in that we reminisced with Jane when she was visiting. And I think that's what she thought might be interesting to include.
Wow. Well, listen, this is a fascinating story, and I hadn't heard the story of the wine before. That actually quite an interesting anecdote and an important gesture, I might add.
Yeah. Yeah, it was very cool because usually these little volunteer groups work on issues. I mean, had no money when we were doing Latin American Solidarity. I mean, it was all volunteers and donations. So to actually get, I don't know, 100 grand or more, which is a lot of money back in the mid 80s, kind of put it, at least while the money lasted for a couple of years, almost on a professional basis, which was very different from the kind of grassroots activism I was involved in, separate from the union movement, which of course has, a dues base.
And did it have a name, that group, and a structure? And
oh God,
you talked about
I'm trying
representation.
to, I can't remember the name. Anti-apartheid. I think it was the Anti-Apartheid Coalition, but I could be wrong. Or the Manitoba Coalition Against Apartheid or something like that. And it had, I think, monthly meetings, just to plan events and stuff and public outreach. Like I said, it was almost 40 years ago when I was involved in a number of other things. In fact, I had a meeting almost every night between Labour Council, Union Local, anti-racism stuff, and then there was this. So it becomes a bit of a jumble after almost 40 years.
Absolutely. And what union were you most active in? Well, you said you joined the union and rose up the ranks.
Well, I was a shopcraft worker, and when I started, there were 21 different unions on the railway, 7 alone just for shopcraft workers, all the American craft unions. I mean, it was actually interesting because I got involved as an apprentice, as a chief organizer for a grassroots movement to get rid of the American craft unions and form an independent democratic Canadian union. I actually got expelled from the machinists, took them to labor board and forced them, had a labor board hearing and won, and was reinstated. So I was in this funny position where the rank and file elected me to the executive as a steward, as whatever, while of course I was kind of a bête noire to the, machinist union. So there's always, so I had good friends in Cup W and QP and, the Canadian unions and among rank and file militants, while being kind of a odd man out within, to the American unions, but that's another whole story. So it always kind of weighed, and on the anecdote, I want to tell you about the MFL, kind of played into that.
Manitoba Federation of Labor.
Yeah.
And you would have been with AIM, the old
IAM,
IAM,
International
International
Association of
Association of
Machinists
Machinists. Yes, that's
and
it.
Aerospace Workers, but usually shortened to the IAM. So maybe I should tell you that anecdote, because that's
Go for
there's
it.
two things that were kind of interesting. When I first got involved, Peter Maslangu was the rep, but then I think some of the history, and all of a sudden he wasn't there anymore. And Bafo, who I we all really liked, who's much more down to earth, much more militant, was the rep. And I can't remember what year, it might have been 86 or 7. There was an MFL convention in Winnipeg, and Bafo was in Winnipeg. And can't remember if it just happened or it came up because of the convention. And we set up an information table. As often our conventions, the lobby, all these groups
Yeah.
have tables, and we're trying to do stuff. And I had inquired about Bafo being representative of, SACTU and the anti-apartheid movement speaking. And of course, the steel workers controlled the presidency, and, their right-wing allies controlled the Federation of Labor. Not so politely declined the opportunity. So me not being the kind of person to take no for an answer, I was trying to think how it worked, because I wasn't a delegate. So I must have got one of my supporters. I'm thinking it might have been Dale Clark, who was president of the Cup W local, and later became president of the National Union. Got up under a point of order and got permission for me to address the convention briefly. And I got up and pretended to be naive and not have had this discussion with Wolf Hudson, the president, and just said how excited I'm sure everyone was to have the representative SACTU actually here, and wouldn't it be great to, to hear from him from the front, and made a motion, which of course, not being a delegate, I couldn't even do. Maybe someone else picked it up and said I move or second, whatever, to have him speak. And of course, the vote was almost unanimous, right? Hands just shot up in the air. You could see the steam coming out of Wolf Hudson's ears, but he was totally overruled. And so Bafo came in from the lobby and gave a barn burner of a speech that got a big ovation. So, that was kind of a neat manipulation of the rules, I guess, but it meant that, Bafo, representing SACTU, actually got to address the convention instead of it just being kept at arm's length.
So this all plays into the famous CLC anti-communist thing where ANC and SACTU are communist based, and so we don't have any trucker trade with them.
Yeah, it was actually kind of a funny epilogue to that is I bumped into Wolf Hudson later in the hallway, and he was very stern. He said, Bob, that's not the way we operate. And I just smiled and said, oh, I'm sorry, Wolf. I didn't realize that the MFL operated like the Communist Party of the Soviet Union. I thought that was a nice ironic dig. He just huffed and walked away. So
that's fantastic. Now, Winnipeg was once upon a time a hotbed of labor and progressive issues. You were there, I guess, a little later than that era of the hotbed times, but nonetheless, a lot of issues with Indigenous people, the railways and others were still passing through there in a lot of ways. Did you ever relate to issues around, for instance, with Indigenous people, with workers of color, with
well, yeah, actually, it's kind of funny. I mean, I should mention that my family's roots are in the north end of Winnipeg. My grandfather was a teamster, and my mother was born in 1913. So I believe my grandfather, just as a rank and file worker, would have been involved peripherally as, because they were socialist Jews in supporting the general strike. And my mother, of course, graduated from university in, I think, 31 or 32. And like women, a lot of people in the Depression, especially educated women, had no job prospects. So she was actually one of the key organizers of the Young Communist League in North End of Winnipeg. In fact, if you looked up the history of what's sometimes called the battle or the riot at Market Square, my mother was one of the key organizers of that, where they drove the fascist and nationalist party over to Winnipeg. So I grew up on those kind of stories. But she moved to Ottawa to get work. She was a chemist. That was her degree during I think it's 38 or 9, when things, of course, picked up. So it's kind of ironic to, many decades after that, to wind up back in Winnipeg. So it's like a big circle for my family.
Red diaper baby goes back to his roots.
Exactly.
That's a fascinating story. So back to my question then about relations with, for instance, the railway. There were people of color famously in the as porters in the trains. Would your union have had any?
Oh yeah, the shops were kind of like the United Nations. There were many waves, as often happened in industry here. Companies thought, especially in the 50s, why train people or when we can just import people from all over the world? So there's a wave of people from Northern Ireland, from the shipyards who were trained, people from the Glasgow shipyards, and English, of course, and then, of course, from the Caribbean. And then after that, from the Philippines, we had a whole crew in the Philippines. So that's why, the anti-racism work and the human rights stuff was, a big part of what I did in the local, as well as, for gay rights, which was not an easy thing to do in the 1980s anywhere, and certainly not in the all-male shop. Oh, and helping get the first women hired on the railway in the shops. But yeah, it's actually funny because of the work I did, and as a steward, taking on management around some racist incidents, I was actually invited. Some rank and file workers of color created a cross union sort of rank and file caucus called the Workers of Color Support Network. And it was funny, a friend of mine, Lance, I believe he was Bahamian, came and told me about it and said they wanted me to, were inviting me to join. So I pointed out, I sort of put my arm against his and said, Lance, I don't know if you've noticed, but I'm actually white. And he said, oh, we know that, but we figure that's only on the outside. On the inside, you're obviously one of us. So I always joke I was the only honky in the Workers of Color Support Network. But I made a point of leaving most of the stuff, obviously the workers of color, and kind of act as consultant when they had questions about how things worked, who was who, how you do a resolution, how to move an issue forward. I would explain because, I had experience in Robert's rules and also being on the Labour Council executive and MFL committees, which they weren't, could tell them, how to do things that might work and move things forward. So that was kind of funny. So obviously, the anti-racism stuff tied in with the, South African anti-apartheid stuff. And that was, it was all kind of mixed up together, because there's really only one issue. You're anti-oppression, you're anti-imperialist, or you're not. And like I said, anti-imperialism, one of the good things is, there's never any shortage of countries and people there oppressing and invading.
Wow, I'm fascinated that you're with IAM, known famously as a very conservative union, but at the local level, you're able to lead all these activist and militant kind of struggles.
Yeah, there's a real difference in the local and the national. A certain amount of separation, naivety. Just as an example, the company at one point, it was a big thing that aided these quality of work life programs. And a lot of companies were doing it, and the Labor Council, and all as part of its education, Labor Councils do these weekend workshops. But actually done a course on quality of work life. So when they brought it in or decided to bring it in, I went to what they called the Federated Crafts. Because after we closely lost that attempt, to overthrow the unions, and I was back in, there was sort of uneasy relationship because they considered me really smart. I was actually on track to become a Grand Lodge rep until I decided to be principal. And so there was kind of this weird relationship. So I went to them and said, we have to fight this, explained what it was from the course. They said, oh my God, this is terrible, because there's that old labor tradition, both from Winnipeg, but also, like I said, you've got a lot of guys from the United Kingdom, where the head of the union, mostly the Irish Club. They came from that old, British trade union militant tradition. That's how they grew up. They said, we can't do this. We'll talk to the International and get help and take this on. Of course, the International, I knew, but I didn't say anything at the time. I knew the IAM was up to their assholes in corporate collaboration and quality of work life. They, of course, came back and were like shocked and disappointed, but decided that they would agree to let me head up a campaign in the shops to kill what the label was total quality, TQ, which we did. So, there was always that kind of give and take and pull of different traditions for the International, based in the States, and that labor tradition that permeated our local. So that was kind of fun.
So that left that space for you to be pushing these issues as you did.
Yeah.
Interesting. Again, Winnipeg, just to keep harping a little bit on it, is famously populated with Indigenous people. How were the relations there?
Well, there really wasn't any. There weren't Indigenous people in the shop that I knew. It was kind of funny because I'd done some work in support. I guess AIM came through and did a tour, and as part of my left stuff, I helped out a bit. And there was something, but they didn't have job. There was. I mean, I had arguments with people. There's something would happen in the news. Say, there's this stuff. Those Indians sit around that. I said, tell me something. How long would you last if we dropped you in the bush 200 miles north of Kenora? And they go, oh, never thought of that, right? I mean, the racism was so deep. When I got my first job as entry level in the reclaim yard, basically the scrap yard where we cut up old stuff, old boxcars, whatever was past its prime, before I got my apprenticeship. And nice to work inside after a year and a half. And I couldn't help noticing that one of the forklift drivers was very clearly Indigenous. So I got talked to, I think his name was Bill Prince. And if you know Manitoba, Prince is a very well-known, clearly Indigenous name. And he'd worked there about 30 years. And I just thought it was cool to actually see an Indigenous person with a good union job. I mean, this is rare as hen's teeth. Turned out his son was actually the chief of the reserve, I think was Pegasus or one of them in the South. So I thought that was really cool. So one time, I went up because, after hundreds of years of contact, some people who are Indigenous is obvious, but he was like the class. You take one look, it's like knowing someone's black. You look at him, he's Indigenous. So again, the issue had come up. We're in the lunchroom about, something, and those Indians they don't work like us. I said, well, but what about your buddy Bill? Well, what about him? Well, he's Indigenous or Indian, whatever we use it. No, he's not. I said, look at him. Like, he actually went up and asked him, like, are you? And Bill smiled and said, of course I am. Like, the racism was so extreme when someone's that obvious that with the first glance when driving by, I knew it. But it's like this blind spot. He has a good union job. He works hard. He has a house in Transcona and a family like everyone else. Therefore, can't be Indigenous because Indigenous people don't do that. So that was kind of an eye opener for people. Oh, great. They'd only worked with him for 30 years.
Holy smokes. Good story. It was an amazing period. And
Mhm.
thankfully we've passed a lot of that.
Yeah.
And well, look, Jane, how about you pitching in here?
Well, this is what struck me about Bob's experience in the 1980s. Every place is a little different. Every workplace is a little different. But particularly in the context of Winnipeg and working on the railway, where there was more United Nations on the railway than a lot of other places. I mean, you found them more diversity in steel plants, but in the worst jobs in the steel plant. So I think your experience says a lot about what progressive people could do and try to do at the local level, despite what was happening at the national levels in, quite frankly, a lot of unions. How much do you think your involvement in those petty anti-imperialist struggles, which were predominant in the 80s, influenced what you went on to do later? Because I know you got quite involved with the Wet'suwet'en struggle, Indigenous struggles on the West Coast. Is it just a sort of a straight line, or how did it that? Because a lot of people that we've talked to
put it another way, are there lessons you learned then that are not being applied now?
Applied now, yes.
Perhaps some of it. I hadn't really thought about that because it's kind of a continuation. Of course, there's a big gap in between. The railways, they were downsizing in the early 90s. I took a buyout because my partner, who was a union rep, wound up moving to Toronto to work with the CAW, which is how we all met Jane. I went back to school and actually got an MBA in finance. I know it's kind of funny. They always wanted, they used to joke, join the dark side, my students, because I'm actually good at this shit. It was kind of odd. But I said, no, I'm going to go work for a union or a cooperative or something and screw all you capitalist bastards, right? We'd laugh. But then Susan, after, I guess we spent about 13 years back in Toronto. So I did this big circle from Ottawa to the prairie, across the prairies, and then back to Toronto. And then we'd always talked about retiring to the West Coast, and a position came open. So then we wound up in Vancouver, in the West Coast. And I'm trying to remember how it worked. I was working with, I've been involved with Occupy, and we had some money left over, and a contact I knew, we were trying to get rid of it, give out, we had about 10 grand. I always joked that we should have put a press release saying that we ran Occupy, fed thousands of people, and still came out with a surplus, and if the government ran more like Occupy, right? But people decided that maybe it wasn't good PR to say we actually, made money on Occupy. But I thought it was good. So anyway, a friend who was working with the Wet'suwet'en was kind of the key organizer. I called them and say, could they use some, a grant, $500,000, whatever. We still had a couple grand to get rid of the good causes. And she had mentioned that, well, yeah, they were putting on some workshops, but also they needed to get some volunteers up to Wet'suwet'en territory in February 2014, I think. And I had a pickup truck to pull our camper trailer, our tent trailer. So I said, I could do that. So I wound up at Wet'suwet'en, and then, of course, been working with them, still work with them. And we formed a group called the Unistoten Solidarity Brigade, and we helped with raising money and run their email list and all that stuff, and of course help build the healing center and all that. And of course I was involved with the the protest blocks, blockades, all that stuff with Indigenous folks that we've done here and supporting with Sudan. I guess I mean the biggest things are about lessons I've learned in many things, including the fight against free trade and all the other stuff, just about coalition building and about how you keep those things from blowing up. I was the chair of the coalition against the war in Toronto, but I learned a lot. I have to give credit to Tony Clark from the Action Canada Network. Learned so much from him about how to chair a meeting and find consensus and keep people together when they seem to be pulling in opposite directions. And I've used, that as part of the, this movement as well. Obviously working with my supporters and a lot of Indigenous folks. So those lessons and styles, tend to work everywhere. I mean, I even use those lessons when I worked in the corporate world which is kind of funny. It's actually in some ways not that different. You got a whole bunch of people sometimes pulling in opposite directions. I was kind of surprised because I kind of thought, it'd be like two different things and I'd have to, it was actually kind of interesting to go from a shop steward to being a department manager, and the same skills work. People are people.
Wow, what a fascinating story, Bob. I'm so excited to have all of this on tape. I think we've really covered a good bit of territory here, Jane.
Yep,
And
yep.
and just before I say thank you, if you had any final word about that,
Yeah.
more specifically the Southern Africa struggle,
Yeah.
and what
Well,
you think
there's
of
one
where it took
other
us.
little anecdote that I always think of that bit of a lesson, and it was kind of slightly humorous. So at one time they decided to do, like a rally, partly protest, partly celebration. I think it was at Victory Park or whatever in Winnipeg. So everyone know we had a couple speakers, and then right in the middle, this big jacked up pickup truck came roaring into the park. A couple guys jumped out in kind of camo type stuff, a couple of young guys in 20, started yelling like kafir and all that stuff. So I was standing with Dale Clark, who was an anarcho-syndicalist, and as I had mentioned, a union leader, local and then national. Well, I don't even remember what happened. Within a blink, I had one of these young guys in a headlock about to pound him. Dale had the other guy in some kind of hold. And Sweetie Reddy's daughter comes running up saying, stop, they're on her side. I'm going, what do you mean, right? And says, this was like street theater, guerrilla theater.
Oh man.
We're trying to give people a flavor of what it's like for people in South Africa to protest. And I just, so I let the kid go. He was like 19 or 20. I guess they're all university students, and said, like, you might have told the union guys about it, because I just about pounded this kid. Right? So anyway, that's anyone who's planning to do that stuff to be a little more strategic about it, because the kid would have wound up with a black eye or some broken teeth within like split second.
Oh,
Great stories. Great stories. Well, I personally thank you very, very much, Bob.
Okay. So
This is a wonderful contribution, and I don't think it was that painful.
No.
A lot of fun for me.
You know what's oldies? You always love reminiscing about the old days.
Well, I'd like to hang on after we hang up, but I'm just going to formally thank you on behalf of the Sac Solidarity Committee and the Southern African, the Canadian Anti-Apartheid Activist History Project. It's a very valuable contribution. I might add that the Library and Archives Canada is very interested in these oral histories as much as any documents that hard copies that we can get. This is living history that's become very, very popular in academic and archival circles now, to get this living history recorded. So thanks for your contribution.
Yeah. It's been a pleasure, and thanks for doing this.
I'm just going to turn the recording off because I do have